Well, after Russia raised the stakes in the war against Ukraine by firing an experimental ballistic missile, the NATO military alliance has said it won't be deterred from supporting Kyiv. NATO will hold an emergency meeting on Tuesday to discuss Russia's launch of the hypersonic intermediate-range missile, but says it will not change the course of the conflict. Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky has said that Russia's use of the weapon is a clear and severe escalation which the world has to respond to. Ukraine says the missile flew for 15 minutes at Mach 11. It hit the Ukrainian city of Dnipro and it has a range of 3,000 miles. That means it's a weapon that could be capable of reaching targets across Europe. Well, President Putin, meanwhile, says Russia reserves the right to use missiles against the military installations of any country which has its self-fired weapons into Russian territory. He said he thinks the United States has got the message. Ukraine is believed to have already used British Storm Shadow missiles to hit targets inside Russia and American ATACMS missiles as well. Well, our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg, has the latest from Moscow.
The Kremlin leader has upped the stakes in an escalating conflict. In an address to the nation, his reaction to Ukraine launching US and British long-range missiles at Russia.
From this moment, as we have underlined many times before, the regional conflict in Ukraine, one provoked by the West, has taken on elements of a global nature.
In response, President Putin said Russia targeted Ukraine with a new intermediate-range ballistic missile. Then, this warning to countries supplying Kyiv with weapons.
We have the right to use our weapons against military facilities of countries that allow their weapons to be used against our sites. And if there is an escalation of aggressive actions, we will respond just as decisively and symmetrically. I recommend ruling elites of countries hatching plans to use their military forces against Russia to think seriously about this.
For months, Vladimir Putin had been warning the West. You allow Ukraine to use your long-range missiles to attack Russia, and we will view that as NATO countries entering a direct confrontation with Moscow. But this national address is the starkest sign so far from Mr. Putin that he is ready to hit back. The UK-made Storm Shadow has a maximum range of around 150 miles. Moscow says Ukraine fired missiles like these into Russia's Kursk region and accuses Britain and America of escalating the war.
The escalation at every turn, at every step, is coming from Russia. They're the ones who are escalating this. They're the ones who started this war. It is because of their aggression into a sovereign territory, Ukraine. And this war can end today. You hear say this over and over again. It can, if Russia would stop the war and stop what they're doing with their aggression.
But little prospect of a Kremlin U-turn. Vladimir Putin has delivered his warning. Now he'll wait to see if the West believes him. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Moscow.
Let's get some more analysis on this with Melinda Herring, who's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Centre and expert on Ukraine. Thanks very much for being with us. So how much of this is Vladimir Putin testing the West?
Hi, Ben. This is Vladimir Putin testing the West and trying to scare us. And I think it's important to have a bit of context. So this is not the first time that Moscow has sent a nuclear-capable missile into Ukraine. So it's really important to stay calm and not to overreact. There's another important fact that I think is missed as well. Ukraine does not have endless Storm Shadows, endless French Scalps, and endless ATACMS. The supply is pretty limited as well.
But it is quite scary, isn't it, for the West, when you think that all this follows, this use of this experimental hypersonic missile with a long range. It comes in the same week that the Russians lowered the threshold at which they could conceivably use nuclear weapons.
Ben, so that decision on nuclear weapons and the doctrine was made back in September. It was published this week. But again, Vladimir Putin is very good at rattling the West. He's brilliant at this, and that's what he's up to. He's made numerous nuclear threats since the war began nearly 3 years ago, and he never makes good on his promise. I think your Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg, has a great analogy. He says Vladimir Putin is a car that can't go in reverse. He has no brakes, and he's not going to get off the road. And he's just careening forward. And we need to not be deterred or rattled by his empty threats.
Is he also, though, waiting for Donald Trump to step back into the White House and perhaps do some sort of deal over Ukraine?
He absolutely is. So Vladimir Putin knows that he has a narrow window to deal with Joe Biden. Joe Biden calculated that he could finally authorize these ATACMS, and he was very, very afraid of crossing a red line and very afraid of escalation. But his White House decided that he had the ability to authorize these weapons because Putin is not going to start a nuclear war just as the U.S. administration is changing over. So yes, Putin is playing the waiting game, but he's also trying to get the White House to reverse his decision. Putin is not a subtle man. He wants to scare the White House and he wants to scare London and get them to reverse their decisions on Storm Shadows and ATACMS.
Where does all this leave Ukraine and Ukraine's military in particular? It's facing real difficulties on the front line in the east, we know that. Also now the presence of North Korean troops and the use of this long-range experimental missile by Russia.
So Ukrainians are undeterred. They've seen this movie before. They're going to continue to fight. They're going to continue to hold the front line. But what you say is true, Ben, that the situation in Kursk is increasingly difficult because of these additional North Korean soldiers. There's at least 11,000 on the ground. We don't know how well they can fight. They haven't seen combat since the 1950s. There's language difficulties. It's different terrain. So I think we're going to have to wait and see how effective those troops are. But the Ukrainians are having a hard time in two different salients in the east, and there is a manpower crunch.
Do you think next year, 2025, is going to be decisive in the war in Ukraine?
So, Ben, everything depends on the decisions that Donald Trump makes. And I don't say that as a proud American. Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has said as much. America gives the most military kit, and if Donald Trump doesn't decide to continue that military kit, Ukraine is going to have to rely very heavily on the Europeans. The Europeans have been sitting on their hands, making great statements, but they haven't been able to really turn up production on the kinds of weapon systems that Ukraine needs. And Ukraine is also going to increasingly look to Asia. It's going to need help from Korea and Japan. And neither of those countries are comfortable sending weapons and would have to change their legal structures in order to do that. But Donald Trump's decision on Ukraine will be a game changer in 2025, and it really determines the outcome of the war in Ukraine.
Melinda, good to have you with us. Melinda Herring, there, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Centre.